Happy New Year. I feel like I haven't seen you since last year. That's terrible. Welcome. If you're watching online, Happy New Year as well. So if you missed Pastor Dan's message last week, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to that. He did a Spotify Wrapped. He gave us some insight into who he is, but he showed us how to look at last year, how to deal with that, and set us up to have a great new year here in 2025. Now, I didn't tell the first service this, but I feel like I should tell you because we're a little bit more intimate than they are, right? The last New Year's message I did was this day 5 years ago, January 5th, 2020. We know how that year turned out. So it could go either way, but hopefully we've learned something. Hindsight is 2020, so okay. All right, back to this year. It's 2025. It's a new year, and I love the new year. Just by flipping the calendar, it's like we get a fresh start, right? We get to wipe the slate clean. We get to do all the things we didn't do last year because it's a new year, right? We get to rebrand. Rebranding is everywhere, from names to logos and even people. No longer is branding specific to corporations or products. Today, every person has a brand. And you're either on brand, off brand, trending up. Today, we launch a series called Rebrand, and we look at how following Jesus should stand out, promote, or even call for rebranding. So rebranding is a marketing term that involves changing the name, image, or design of a product, service, person, or company to create a new identity. So I thought we'd have a little bit of fun here, then we won't have any afterwards. A little bit of fun and look at some rebranding examples. So who is this? Prince. And Prince rebranded to? Nobody knows, right? It's a symbol. We don't know how to pronounce that. That's right. He rebranded to a symbol. How about this guy? Who's this? Chad Johnson, who rebranded to Chad Ocho Cinco. He legally changed his name to his jersey number. He's since changed it back years ago, but he rebranded. How about some failed rebrands? Who's this guy? Okay, that one's hard. We'll come back to it. We'll come back to that. Who's this guy? Garth Brooks, right? Garth Brooks had 6 albums go diamond in a span of 7 years. Now, they calculate that gold is 500 units sold. Platinum is 1 million. Multi-platinum is 2 million with increments of 1 million. Diamond is 10 million units sold. He was a giant in the late 1900s. He was so big back then, dare I say, he was as big back then as Tay-Tay. T-Swizzle, that's right, Taylor Swift is today. Now, before all you Swifties go get mad at me, it's just a comparison. But we all know Taylor Swift is only famous because she's dating Travis Kelce. We all know that. All right, back to Garth. He also released greatest hit albums that went diamond. He had the largest crowds in the day. And he thought at the height of his popularity, he would rebrand to an emo artist named Chris Gaines. And we all know, and today we call him Garth Brooks, because it was a train wreck, and in fact, the rebranding never even happened. How about a successful rebrand? We all know Apple, but how about Stanley Drinkware, right? Stanley cups were invented by William Stanley in 1913. He had a simple goal to keep his coffee hot all day. So he invented an all-steel, double-walled, vacuum-formed bottle, and he put his name on it. Now, if you don't know William Stanley, he has over 100 patents. He's a very successful inventor. But Stanley thermoses have been around forever, and they've been big with outdoor enthusiasts and blue-collar workers. But the struggling company became the hottest Christmas gift in 2023 because they softened their look, they expanded their color wheel, and they used social media influencers who appealed to women. Now, I couldn't find sales numbers before 2019. I didn't look very hard, but I couldn't find any. But in 2019, their sales were $74 million. In 2023, their sales were over $750 million. Rebranding can be very successful, but it's not new. We have either intentionally or unintentionally been rebranding since the beginning. Adam and Eve rebranded God's plan in the garden. The greatest day in history, in my opinion, Jesus had died, he was buried, he rose again, he conquered death, he did what we couldn't do, he made a way for us back to God for all humanity, and the people in power of that day paid the guards to say the disciples came in the middle of the night and stole his body. You can read about that in Matthew 28, but verse 15 says, "And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." We sometimes continue to rebrand what God is telling us even today. But Jesus is the OG. He's the best at rebranding, and Jesus came to rebrand religion and religious people. He wasn't the king they were looking for. He came to serve, not to be served. He lived different, he loved different, and he obeyed God different. So one of my favorite apostles is Peter. So we're going to look at his life pre-fall and post-fall. Peter had a major failure. We're going to look at his life, and hopefully we can learn something from him to help us rebrand who God is calling us to be in 2025. So we're going to start in Luke chapter 5. This is when Peter meets Jesus. I'm not going to read the whole scripture, but you can follow along. The people were crowded around him and listening. Jesus was teaching, right? He saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one that belonged to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from shore. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put into deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Simon answers, "Master, we've been working all night and haven't caught anything, but because you say so, I will let down the nets." They caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. They signaled for their partners. Both boats were so full that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." All his companions were astonished, and so were James and John. "Don't be afraid," said Jesus. "From now on, you will fish for people." They left everything and they followed Jesus. So I think there's some things that we can learn when we encounter God. What do we see? From Peter's story, and it's true for us, but when we encounter God, God meets you where you are. Simon was at work. He was doing his daily routine. He was fishing. And that's why here at Life Church, our mission is to send everybody to live a bold life in Jesus where you live, work, learn, and play. Because Jesus may not be physically walking around on this earth, but he lives in me and he lives in you. And there's people where you live, work, learn, and play that are waiting to encounter God. And it's our job as believers to take him to them. I think we can also see that sometimes when we meet God, or when God meets us, we get inconvenienced. Simon had to take his boat back out after fishing all night and just cleaning his nets. I'm sure he was exhausted. He was probably ready to shut it down, watch a little TV, and relax. But he was inconvenienced by Jesus asking him to go back out. I think we can also see in verse 5 that sometimes when God meets us, we think we know better. We think our way is better. I think this is what Peter was saying in verse 5. He's saying, Jesus, you're the teacher, you're the preacher, you've done a great job, keep it up, but I'm a fisherman. I know when to fish, and it's not during the day, it's at night. I know where to fish, it's not in the deep, it's not there. And I know how to fish, but because you're who you are, I'll let the nets down, if for no other reason to prove that you're wrong. We tend to know better than God. But when we do meet God, we have an opportunity to understand him more. See, you understand who you are when God shows up in your life. When God moves in a mighty way, you can't not understand how big he is, how great he is, how large his love is, which then tells you who you are. God is so big, we are so small. When Peter Simon saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man." But also notice that when God shows up in your life, he affects you and those around you. For he and all his companions were astonished, and so were James and John. And of course, Jesus rebrands you. Don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. See, Jesus met Peter at work, and he showed him a glimpse of what his life could be. He took what he knew, which was fishing, and he tweaked it for kingdom purposes and made him fishers of people. You get rebranded by Jesus, but when you're rebranded by Jesus, it will cost you something. They left everything and followed him. It could be your old way of life. It could be your job. It could be a hurt, a habit, or a hang-up. It could be your family or friends or maybe a possession. But you can't follow Jesus well if you continue to do exactly what you have been doing. So from here, Peter meets Jesus, and Peter saw Jesus heal leprosy, paralyzed men, demon-possessed. Jesus rebranded how religious people should speak, how they should act. Jesus ate with sinners, healed on the Sabbath. He loved differently. He taught differently. Peter saw him feed thousands with little. He saw him raise the dead, and much, much more. Peter, remember, was the only apostle to walk on water next to Jesus. He's the only one to know what that felt like. So for 3 years, Peter walked with Jesus. Now, if we're going to be honest, he didn't always get it right? But he tried. Peter was quick to act and even quicker to speak. One might say that Peter must have worn cherry-flavored sandals because he was always putting his foot in his mouth. We see that so well in Matthew 16, verse 13. Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Verse 16, Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replies, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." What high praise. Can you imagine standing face to face with Jesus and hearing these words spoken to you? It'd be unbelievable, right? The very next verse, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection. And Peter, who was just praised, chimes in on time and on brand and says, "Never, Lord," he said, "this shall never happen to you." And Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me." This was Peter. He's always putting his foot in his mouth. So we have a good idea of who Peter is. So we're going to look at Luke 22, starting in verse 31. And it says, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you all as wheat. But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith will not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brother. But he replied, Lord, I am ready to go to prison and to death. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. So right out of the gate, I don't think it's ever good if Jesus calls your name twice. But I don't think it's like a parent, like Derek Stephen Sherman. I don't think it was like that. I think it was more of like a, oh, bless your heart, Peter. Like, Peter, oh, Peter. Peter, Satan has asked to take you down. He's asked to take you out. Notice that he says he's going to sift all of you, but he's talking directly to Peter. Many theologians will say that Satan can only attack where you have already opened the door to sin. Meaning there's something going on in Peter's life, and Satan wants to dig in there. He wants to turn up the heat. He wants to attack right there. But we should also notice that Satan still has to get permission to attack you. Because as a follower of Jesus, you belong to God through Jesus. There is no mistake that we were bought at a price, and that price was Jesus' life when he hung on a cross and died for our sins and rose again so we can have new life. We belong to God. So if we belong to God, why would he ever allow Satan to attack? It's a great question. I'm glad you asked. He wants to strengthen you. He wants to build you up. He wants to build your character. He wants to build an area in your life where you're lacking because he's not done with you yet. Verse 32. But I have prayed for you. The Bible shows us that Jesus speaks to his Father on our behalf. Romans 8:34 says that Jesus is at the right hand of God and is always interceding for us. 1 John 2:1 reads that Jesus is our advocate with the Father. Hebrews 7:25, we learn that Jesus always lives to intercede on our behalf. But I am praying for you, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. This is why I love the Bible so much. In every book, every story, and every verse, there is so much in there. When you've turned back, meaning I'm praying for you, Peter, because Satan is going to take you out, but you're going to get back up again. You're going to turn back again. You're going to turn to me again, Peter. We already know that Peter turned once because we just read that in Luke 5. But here Jesus is telling him to get ready because he's going to fall. He's going to fail. But don't worry, even before that happens, you'll turn back to me. See, if we don't self-correct, God will let Satan attack you to bring your sin to light for your transformation, for your sanctification, and for God's purpose. It's kind of a good news, bad news situation happening here, right? God cares too much about you. He loves you too much to leave you where you are. Even if you've been following Jesus for a long time, years or decades, even if you've walked on water, even if you've said and done the right things, God wants to continuously move you from where you are to where he is because he's not done with you yet. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. After you have fallen, and after God has worked in your life again, and you have turned back again, use your story to strengthen others. Here at Life Church, we call those bold stories. And we say that everybody has a story. Your story is God's story. And God wants to use your story to impact others for his kingdom purpose. You are going to mess up, but in Jesus there is victory, there is grace, there is forgiveness, and there is another chance. So what was the area that Satan was going to attack in Peter? Verse 33. Lord, I am ready to go with you to prison and to death. It was pride. I love how Mark wrote this same exact story. Mark says, you will all fall away, but Peter declares, even if all fall away, I will not. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you, Jesus. We see how passionate and emphatic Peter is that he's not going to deny Jesus. They just had the Last Supper. Jesus drops this bomb that they're all going to fall away. They're shocked, and Pete jumps up, right? He's like, I got you, Jesus. I'm your boy, Jesus. No matter if all these other suckers fall away, I won't, Jesus. I'm the man, I got you. But despite Peter's zeal, don't miss the fact that Jesus told him everything. He told him when, where, and how many times he was going to fall. And of course, we know Peter did exactly as Jesus predicted. And we see that in Mark 14, starting in verse 66. While Peter was below in the courtyard, notice it says while Peter, he was alone, never a good idea. A servant girl said, you also were with Jesus, but he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said. This fellow is one of them. Again, he denied it. Surely you are one of them. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Not only did Peter deny Jesus, but he started cursing at them. It's probably not a good idea, but if I'm being honest, when I fail, when I fall, I too typically go all in. It's a good reminder that hurting people hurt people. Verse 72, immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Now, I know I've really honed in on this point, but you got to remember, this is Peter, Mr. Big Shot, right? I'll go to prison with you, Jesus. I will die with you, Jesus. And he couldn't last one night. He couldn't hold it together for one night. The theological word apostasy is the public denial of Jesus Christ. Some say it's one of the worst things that you could do, but know this. We are about to learn that there is no sin Jesus cannot forgive if you turn back to him. And that includes yours. So before we see how this story ends, I want to quickly look at one of my favorite verses around this story. It's in Mark 16, verse 7. It's a short verse, but there's 2 little words that are just little gold nuggets. And I'm going to read it and see if you can identify it. But the verse says, but go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. Did you see it? But go, tell his disciples and Peter. And Peter. These 2 little words are so important because of everything that we just read and everything that we're about to read. Let me paraphrase. Don't stay here. Go tell his disciples. And then a pause and a smile, and especially tell Peter. What a line. It's as if all of heaven had watched Peter fall, and all of heaven were just cheering him on to get back up again. But be sure to tell Peter that he's not left out. Tell him that one mistake does not define a life. Your past does not define who Jesus wants you to be. We see this in John 21. I'm going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we'll go with you. So they went out and they got into the boat, But that night they caught nothing. Sound familiar? Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not recognize it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your nets on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul in the net because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple who Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. They saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. And Jesus said, "Come and have breakfast." So Peter falls hard, and then where do we find him? We find him back in his old life, his old ways, his old career. He had given up and he had left the ministry. He left the life that Jesus had already called him to. He was back home. He did exactly what he said he would never do, and he did it exactly how Jesus predicted. He messed up, he was knocked down, and he was out of the game. He knew shame and humiliation. Have you been there? Are you there now? What's great is God does not leave us in our stuff. Just like in Luke 5, God met Peter where he was at work, and he does it again here in John chapter 21, even though Peter had given up. But notice this time, Peter's not alone. His friends were there. And even though Jesus used the exact same miracle that he used when he first met Peter, it wasn't until John said, "It is the Lord," that Peter figured it out. Sometimes when we're in the middle of our stuff, we can't even recognize God or what God is doing when he's right in front of us. The reason is most of the time we want to isolate. We're ashamed. We want to get away from everybody, but we need friends. We need community. We need fellow believers on our side. We need friends to point out that God is still with us even when we can't see it. So then it seems like Peter goes back to being Peter, right? He couldn't wait to see Jesus. He jumps into the water. He swam to shore. He couldn't wait for the boat to get back. He's ready to go. When God shows up, you go. I think Peter showed this a lot. But when God shows up in your life, even after you failed or after you succeeded, you go. Verse 9. They saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. Jesus was being hospitable. He was cooking them breakfast. He was serving them. Many versions say a charcoal fire. And a charcoal fire is so significant because the word charcoal is only used 2 times in the New Testament. It's used right here, and it's used in John 18:18. And John 18:18 is when Peter is warming himself by the fire right before he denies Jesus 3 times. See, Jesus has taken Peter back to his failure. Not because he's trying to shame him, but because he wants him to deal with it. Because he's not done with him yet. John 21, verse 15. When they had finished eating, this is where it gets good, y'all. Get ready. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said, "you know I love you." Why would Jesus even ask him if he loved him? Because he's taken him back. He took him back to the fire, the aroma, the senses of what happened. But he's saying, "Peter, the last time you and I spoke, you said I was your boy. You said that you would not deny me. You said if all these other losers fall away that you wouldn't. You said you would even die for me, Peter. So I'm just checking in. Where are you now? Do you still love me? And notice that he calls him Simon and not Peter. John 1:42, Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. Jesus had already rebranded him as Peter, but Peter went back to his old ways. He went back to his old career. He was doing his old life before he met Jesus, and Jesus calls him by that name, Simon. We also have to understand, just in this one verse, that Jesus and Peter are using two completely different words for love. Jesus is using the word agape. We may know that word. It's the highest form of love. It's God's sacrificial love that transcends all. But Peter is using the Greek word phileo, which means brotherly love or friendly affection. Phileo, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love. Now, as a Cowboys fan, I haven't felt agape love from any Philadelphia fans. But they're using two different words for love. But notice that Peter slows his roll. Peter slows down. Normally, Peter would be quick to act and quicker to speak, but after he's falling, he kind of pumps the brakes. Peter thought he agape'd Jesus prior, right? But I've fallen since then, Jesus. I have failed. I understand more now. I understand who I really am. And God, Jesus, I cannot bring myself to say I agape you. But Jesus says, feed my lambs. Even though Peter was back in his old life and his passion seemed to simmer, Jesus calls him back into ministry. It's okay, Peter. I'll take you where you are. Now come feed my lambs. Verse 16. Again, Jesus said, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Again, Jesus uses the word agape. Peter answers with phileo. Peter hasn't done anything yet, and he gets promoted. He went from, at first, feeding my lambs to taking care of my sheep. He goes from babies to grown-ups. Verse 17. The third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him for a third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know I love you. Jesus answers, feed my sheep. Don't just tend to my sheep, feed my sheep, pour into my sheep. Take care of my sheep. Jesus asked him a third time, but this time, Jesus uses the word phileo. Peter was hurt because he asked the third time. Because remember, Jesus took him back to the fire, took him back to where it happened. Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and Jesus wanted him to affirm him 3 times. But the third time, Jesus makes it easy. Jesus accepts Peter where he's at, and he says, it's okay if you don't agape me, Peter. I'll meet you where you are. So as followers of Jesus, what I hope you realize is that we are constantly being refined, redefined, and rebranded. He's continually moving us from who we are to who he is. Doesn't matter how long that we've been following him. So as we close,